The night I decided to walk into that ambush, I did something nobody in 30 years of this life had ever seen a man in my position do. I burned everything. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. I mean, I stood in my basement at 2:47 in the morning, poured accelerant across 4 leather-bound ledgers that contained the financial skeleton of a criminal empire worth $900 million, and I struck a match. I watched it all go. Names, accounts, routes, contacts. 22 years of careful, meticulous, obsessive record-keeping, gone in 11 minutes. And then I put on my coat, and I walked out the door, toward the people who were waiting to kill me. Now here's what nobody understood that night. Not my enemies, not my crew, not even the man I trusted most in this world. Nobody understood why. And that question, why would a man who had everything, who had survived everything, who had outthought every opponent for 2 decades, why would that man burn his protection and walk unarmed into a trap? The answer is the most dangerous thing I've ever told anyone. So listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. Intro. My name is Dominic Cross. I am not going to tell you I'm a good man. I stopped lying to myself about that somewhere around year 4 of this life, in a parking garage in Newark, watching a man beg for something I had already decided not to give him. What I am going to tell you is this: I am precise, I am patient, and in 30 years of operating in the spaces between what is legal and what is necessary, I have never made a move that wasn't calculated at least 3 steps ahead. The night I burned those ledgers was not a breakdown. It was not fear. It was the most calculated thing I have ever done. Those ledgers, those 4 leather-bound books that I kept in a fireproof safe behind a false wall in my basement, they were not just financial records. They were weapons, the kind that cut both ways. Every account number, every payment, every transaction, every name of every judge, every politician, every port authority officer, every detective, every union boss who had ever taken money from my organization, all of it, written in my own handwriting, organized by date, cross-referenced by jurisdiction. If those books had ever fallen into the wrong hands, an entire city's infrastructure would have collapsed. Not just my empire, the city itself. So when I burned them, I wasn't just destroying evidence. I was making a statement. And that statement was the opening move of the most dangerous game I had ever played. This is what happened. The empire and the ledgers. Let me tell you how an empire gets built. Not the way they show it in the movies, with slow-motion suits and jazz music and everybody looking cool. That's the fantasy version, designed to make it romantic. The reality is bureaucratic. The reality is boring and relentless, and it smells like cigarettes and anxiety, and the particular kind of sweat a man produces when he knows that one wrong signature could put him in a cell for 40 years. An empire gets built the same way any business gets built. You find a gap in the market, you fill it, you reinvest your margins, you expand into adjacent territories, you manage your personnel, you handle your liabilities. The difference in my business is that the liabilities sometimes breathe. I started with nothing. My father ran numbers out of a laundromat in South Philly. He died owing money to people who were 3 rungs below the people I would eventually become. I was 19 when I started running packages for a man named Gerald Fitch, not a romantic name for a criminal, but Gerald was about as unromantic as they came. He was practical, he was invisible, and he saw something in me that I didn't fully understand at the time. He saw that I kept records. Not officially. Nobody in our world kept official records. That was a death sentence, a paper trail, a gift to federal prosecutors. But I kept records in my head. I remembered every number, every date, every face, every arrangement. Gerald would test me sometimes, ask me out of the blue about a deal we'd made 8 months prior, and I'd recite it back to him, the amount, the location, the name of the intermediary, the percentage breakdown. He'd just nod and walk away. When Gerald died in 2001, natural causes, believe it or not, which is rarer in this life than you'd think, he left me two things. His territory, which covered 6 city blocks and 3 legitimate businesses, and a single leather-bound ledger. His ledger. I opened it once, read every page, then I understood. Gerald had been doing for 20 years what I'd been doing in my head. He'd been writing it all down. Every arrangement, every relationship, every vulnerability, every leverage point. The ledger wasn't a record of crimes. It was a map of power. And power, at its core, is just information organized correctly. I started my own ledger the next day. By 2008, I had 3. By 2015, I had 4. By the night I burned them, those 4 books represented the most complete picture of organized crime operations on the eastern seaboard that had ever existed outside of a federal building. And I'm not saying that with pride. I'm saying it because it's what made me simultaneously the most powerful and the most vulnerable man in a 400-mile radius. Anyone who got those ledgers got everything, got my organization, got every ally I'd ever made, got leverage over half the political apparatus of 3 major cities, got enough to either extort an empire or dismantle one. The ledgers were protection, yes, but they were also a target. And by 2023, I had started to feel people circling that target. Now, you need to understand 2 men to understand what came next. The first is Marcus Webb. Marcus had been with me since 2004. He came to me as an enforcer, which is to say he was physically large and emotionally unreadable, and he did not hesitate when hesitation was the wrong choice. But Marcus was not just muscle. Marcus was, and I say this with full knowledge of what the word means in this context, he was loyal. Not loyal the way a dog is loyal, reflexive, and unthinking. Loyal the way a soldier is loyal when he's chosen his war and decided that the cause is worth the cost. Marcus was 41 years old. He had a daughter named Claire who was studying biochemistry at Penn State. He sent her money every month. He went to her debates when she was in high school. He kept her photograph in his jacket pocket, not in his wallet where someone might see it, but in his jacket pocket where only he knew it was there. He never talked about her, not once. But I knew, I always knew. Marcus handled the situations that required a physical presence. When a partner became a problem, when a boundary needed to be enforced, when someone needed to understand in terms that transcended language that an agreement was final. He was precise, he was quiet, and he had saved my life on 3 separate occasions in ways I will not describe here. The second man is Raymond Cho. Raymond was 63 years old. He had a PhD in financial mathematics from the University of Chicago and had spent 12 years at a legitimate investment bank before a securities fraud conviction in 2001 had ended his conventional career. He came to me through a mutual contact in 2003, and within 18 months, he had restructured my entire financial operation in a way that reduced our federal exposure by 60%, while increasing our net yield by 38%. Raymond was small, soft-spoken. He dressed in the kind of deliberately understated clothes that very careful men wear when they don't want to be remembered. He drank green tea. He had 2 cats. He had not, to my knowledge, committed an act of physical violence in his entire life. He was also the most dangerous man in any room he entered. Because Raymond understood money the way surgeons understand the body, not as a collection of separate parts, but as a system, interconnected, with pressure points and fail-safes and vulnerabilities that were invisible to everyone who hadn't spent decades studying the anatomy. Raymond kept the ledgers with me, meaning he was the only other person who had ever read them in their entirety. He updated them quarterly. He cross-referenced them against our operational data. He ran projections. He flagged risks. He called it hygiene, keeping the information clean. I called it survival. Raymond and Marcus, precision and force, the two pillars of everything I had built. Which is why what came next broke something in me that had not been broken since I was 19 years old in a parking garage in Newark, watching a man beg. The warning. It started with a phone call I almost didn't take. October. The kind of October that smells like cold concrete and dead leaves, and the first hint of the particular desperation that comes with winter approaching in a city that doesn't forgive weakness. I was in my office, a legitimate office, in a legitimate building, behind the door of a licensed import consulting firm that I had operated for 11 years, and that had filed accurate tax returns every single year, because Raymond had insisted on it from the beginning. The best camouflage, Raymond had told me in 2003, is boring legitimacy. Nobody looks twice at a man who pays his taxes. The call came from a number I didn't recognize, a 412 area code, Pittsburgh. I almost let it go to voicemail. I don't know why I answered. Some instinct. The kind that doesn't have a name but that you learn to trust when you've been in this life long enough to understand that the moments that don't feel important are often the ones that are. The voice on the other end was a man I'll call Victor. I won't use his real name because he's still alive, and I made him a promise, and I keep my promises even to people who probably don't deserve them. Victor was mid-level. He ran operations for the Solano family out of western Pennsylvania, a family that had historically maintained a neutral relationship with my organization. Not allies, not enemies, the diplomatic middle ground that in our world requires constant, invisible maintenance, like a garden that dies the moment you stop tending it. Victor said 4 words. "They're moving on you." I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence sit for 3 full seconds because, in my experience, silence is the most reliable way to make a man say more than he intended to. "The Caruso people," he said, "and they've got help from inside." I hung up. I sat for exactly 4 minutes without moving. I know it was 4 minutes because I was looking at the clock on my desk, a small desk clock that had belonged to Gerald Fitch, that I had kept not out of sentimentality, but because it kept perfect time. The Carusos. Let me explain the Carusos. Anthony Caruso had inherited his family's operation in 2019 when his father, Vincent Caruso, died of a stroke at 71. Anthony was 34. He was educated. He wore Italian suits. He gave money to hospitals and appeared at charity galas and had his photograph taken with senators. He was, on the surface, precisely the kind of modern criminal who had learned from the previous generation's mistakes, low profile, institutionally connected, publicly generous. But Anthony Caruso was also, beneath the suits and the charity galas, a man who was running out of room to grow. His family's territory bordered mine on 2 sides. For 3 years, he had been pushing at those borders in small ways. A distribution arrangement here, a partnership offer there, each one reasonable on its surface. Each one, underneath, a test of pressure. How far could he push before I pushed back? I had pushed back quietly each time. But I had underestimated something. I had underestimated his patience. Because Anthony Caruso had not been making small moves out of timidity. He had been making small moves while assembling something larger. He had been building the coalition for a strike, and not just a territorial dispute, not a negotiation backed by force, an elimination. He wanted me gone, not diminished, not repositioned, gone. And according to Victor, he'd found someone inside my organization willing to help him do it. This is the part that, even now, even knowing how it ended, this is the part that sits in my chest like a stone. Because I had built my entire operation on loyalty, not bought loyalty, earned loyalty, the kind you build over years of showing people that you value them, protect them, see them as human beings rather than assets. I paid well. I protected families. When one of my people had a problem, a health crisis, a legal situation, a personal emergency, I handled it, quietly and completely. I had made myself the kind of leader that people don't betray. Or so I had believed. I called Marcus that night, not on the phone. I sent a message through a channel that we used for sensitive communication, a system Raymond had designed, layered, paranoia-proof, the kind of thing that would have impressed the people at Fort Meade if they'd known it existed. Marcus was at my house within 40 minutes. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, not my office, my kitchen, where I have never had a business conversation in my life, because I have always kept my home and my work separated by a wall that I refuse to allow anyone to breach. And he listened while I told him what Victor had said. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Who do you think it is?" And this is the thing that will tell you everything about how good Marcus Webb was at his job. He didn't ask if it was true. He didn't ask if I was sure. He accepted the intelligence at face value and moved immediately to the tactical question. "I don't know yet," I said. "Give me 72 hours. You have 48. He nodded and stood up. "Marcus." He stopped. "Nobody talks. Nobody moves until I say so. Whatever you find, you bring it to me first. You don't act on it, you understand." He looked at me for a moment. In the kitchen light, I could see the scar along his jaw, the remnant of a night in 2009 that I will not discuss. And I could see in his eyes that specific quality he had, that absolute stillness, like a body of water with very deep currents. "I understand," he said. He left. I sat at my kitchen table for another hour. I was not afraid. Fear, in my experience, is a signal. It tells you that something real is happening, that the stakes have become physical. Fear is useful when you respect it and catastrophic when you don't. What I felt was something colder than fear. I felt the first edge of something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt the possibility that I had been wrong. Because the paranoia that followed those 48 hours, the paranoia that seeped into every interaction, every look, every word, that is a specific kind of hell that I would not wish on anyone. I sat in meetings with my people and I watched their faces with a new lens. Every hesitation became suspicious. Every moment of eye contact that lasted half a second too long, every slight shift in posture, every laugh that came just slightly too easily. I have read that interrogators describe this same phenomenon. Once you start looking for deception, you begin to see it everywhere, and the danger is not that you'll miss the traitor, but that you'll start to see treachery in the innocent. I was aware of this. I was monitoring my own paranoia as carefully as I was monitoring my people. Raymond came to me on the second day. He sat down across from my desk with his green tea and his quiet face, and he placed a single sheet of paper in front of me. 3 anomalies, he said, over the past 4 months. I looked at the paper. 3 entries, each flagged with Raymond's neat, small handwriting. The first was a timing irregularity in a cash movement that had been slightly off pattern. The kind of thing that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't running Raymond-level analysis on the financial data. The second was an unexplained meeting that one of my mid-level people had attended, flagged by a contact who had seen it by accident and mentioned it casually, not knowing its significance. The third was a gap in communication patterns, a specific phone that had gone quiet at a specific moment. And quiet in our world can mean many things, but one of those things is that someone has switched to a different phone. I looked at the 3 entries for a long time. "These all point in the same direction?" I asked. Raymond took a careful sip of his tea. "They suggest a possibility," he said. "I wouldn't call it confirmation. But if you had to..." He set his cup down. "If I had to," he said, "yes, they point in the same direction." He didn't name the direction. He didn't need to. I nodded, "Thank you, Raymond." He picked up his cup and left. I looked at the paper for another 10 minutes. Then I locked it in my desk. And I started to think. The decision to burn everything. There is a specific quality to decisions made at 2 a.m. that decisions made at 2 p.m. do not have. In daylight, logic is the dominant force. You weigh, you calculate, you project outcomes. You are fundamentally a rational actor in a rational framework. But at 2 a.m., something deeper comes up. The parts of your mind that don't operate through language. The parts that are older and slower and less articulate, but sometimes, not always, but sometimes more honest. At 2 a.m. on October 19th, I was in my basement. Not packing, I don't pace. I was sitting in a chair I'd had down there for years, a plain wooden chair, nothing decorative about it. Just a chair I kept there for exactly this kind of occasion. The occasions when I needed to be somewhere without comfort, somewhere that didn't encourage staying too long, somewhere that focused the mind. The safe was open. The 4 ledgers were stacked on the floor in front of me. I had been looking at them for 40 minutes. Let me tell you what those ledgers represented, beyond the information they contained. They represented the version of myself that believed in permanence. The version that thought if you documented everything, controlled everything, mapped everything, you could maintain a grip on an enterprise that is, by its fundamental nature, ungovernable. The criminal world, despite its hierarchies and its codes and its rituals of loyalty, is at its core a chaos system. Things fall apart. People make unexpected choices. External forces intrude in unpredictable ways. The ledgers were my attempt to impose order on chaos, to make the ungovernable legible. And for 22 years, it had worked. But now the ledgers were a liability in a way they had never been before. If the Carusos were planning a strike, they would not simply try to kill me. That would be, and this is the word I kept returning to, messy. Killing a man of my position without controlling the aftermath is like cutting a high-voltage wire without knowing what it's connected to. The shock goes everywhere. It destabilizes everything. Anthony Caruso was too intelligent for that kind of recklessness. What Anthony wanted was leverage. He wanted the ledgers. If he got them, he didn't need to kill me. He could simply own me. Present the ledgers to the right people, federal prosecutors, rival families, the political figures who appeared in those pages, and I would have no choice but to capitulate or watch everything collapse. He could dismantle my empire with paper rather than violence. And there was another possibility, a darker one. If the person inside my organization who was feeding information to Anthony Caruso had already communicated the existence of the ledgers, their location, their contents, their value, then the ambush wasn't just about removing me. It was about taking them. So the ledgers were no longer protection. They were bait. And in that moment, sitting in my basement at 2 a.m. looking at 22 years of my life stacked in 4 leather volumes, I understood something that changed everything. The only way to remove the bait was to destroy it. And the only way to destroy it was to do it completely, immediately, and without hesitation. But here is what no one would understand about that decision. Here is what I need you to hear. It wasn't just tactical. I sat there for another 20 minutes before I reached for the first ledger. I picked it up and held it for a moment. It was heavier than it looked, not physically, I mean in another way. The weight of everything recorded inside it. The weight of the relationships, the arrangements, the choices. The weight of 2 decades of a life that I had chosen and then continued to choose, every single day in ways that became less and less reversible. I thought about Gerald Fitch. I thought about that first ledger he'd left me. I thought about the 19-year-old version of myself who had opened it and felt, for the first time, that he understood how power actually worked. I thought about what it cost to hold that kind of power. I thought about Marcus Webb's daughter studying biochemistry at Penn State. I thought about Raymond Cho's 2 cats. I thought about all the people whose lives intersected with mine in ways they had not entirely chosen. I put the ledger down, and I said out loud to no one in my basement at 2 a.m. The map was never the territory. I don't know exactly what I meant, or maybe I do and I can't fully explain it, but something in me, something that had been holding on, holding tight, gripping the idea that documentation was control, that information was permanence, something released. I got the accelerant from the utility shelf. I stacked the ledgers on the concrete floor away from the walls. I poured carefully. I was precise even in this. I left nothing to chance. I struck the match, and I watched. 11 minutes. That's how long it took. I timed it on Gerald's clock, which I had brought downstairs with me. I don't know why. Some gesture toward continuity, maybe. Some acknowledgement that even what you destroy is connected to what came before. The flames were orange and then blue at their cores. The leather covers curled before they caught. The pages, all that paper, all those numbers, all those names, they didn't burn the way you'd think. They didn't disappear cleanly. They went through stages. First brown, then black. Then they crumbled at their edges and collapsed inward. I watched every page go. I did not look away. When it was done, I stood over the ash for a moment. Then I put on my coat. And I said the thing that I have said since. The thing that I said to myself as I walked up the stairs and out the door. The most powerful move on any board is the one your opponent doesn't know you've made. Walking into the trap. The meeting had been arranged for a warehouse on the waterfront. This is almost laughable in its cliché, I know. A waterfront warehouse. It sounds like something from a bad television drama, but the geography of criminal confrontation tends toward a narrow range of locations because the requirements are specific. Isolation, privacy, controllable access, plausible deniability. Waterfront warehouses satisfy all four conditions. They are clichés because they work. The Carussos had communicated through an intermediary, a lawyer named Patrick Saul, who represented several construction interests connected to Anthony's legitimate business holdings, who had reached out to one of my legal contacts to suggest a mediation. A meeting between representatives of both sides to discuss territorial adjustments. Territorial adjustments, the language of diplomacy wrapped around the language of threat. I had received this request 3 days after Victor's call. 3 days during which Marcus had completed his investigation, brought me his findings in a sealed envelope, and stood in my kitchen while I read the contents, and said nothing when I folded the paper and placed it in my jacket pocket. I had accepted the meeting. This had surprised everyone who knew about it. Raymond had come to me privately and said in his careful, measured way, "Dominic, the meeting is not a negotiation. You understand that?" "I do," I said. "Then why?" "Because sometimes," I said, "the only way to end a war is to let it start." Raymond had looked at me for a moment with that expression he occasionally allowed himself, the one where his control slipped just slightly and something underneath it showed. Something that might have been, in another life, in another context, fear on my behalf. "The ledgers," he said. "Gone." He absorbed this. His face returned to its composed default. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and he left. The night of the meeting was cold. That specific cold that comes off water, the kind that finds the gaps in clothing and settles into joints and makes everything feel slightly more exposed than it actually is. I drove myself. This was the first thing that would have alarmed Marcus if I had told him what I was doing, which I had not. I was alone in the car. I had no weapon. This was the second alarming thing. Let me tell you what it feels like to drive toward an ambush you know is waiting for you, unarmed, alone, in the cold. It is quiet, the quietest I have ever been inside my own head, and I am generally a quiet person internally. I am not given to the kind of mental noise that afflicts many people, the constant self-narration, the anxious rehearsal of possible outcomes. But this quiet was different. This was the quiet of a decision fully made, fully committed to, beyond the reach of second thoughts, because second thoughts require an openness to reversal, and I had closed that door. I was not peaceful. I want to be precise about that. Peace implies the absence of stakes, and the stakes were absolute. What I was instead was aligned. Every part of me, the calculating part, the instinctual part, the part that had been in this life for 30 years, was pointing in the same direction. I parked the car 2 blocks from the warehouse and walked. The waterfront at that hour was not empty. Waterfronts are never truly empty. There is always activity, the movement of commerce that does not observe conventional hours. But the specific stretch of dock near the warehouse was quiet. I could hear the water, that particular sound of water against pier structures, rhythmic and slightly hollow. I could see light in the warehouse through the gaps in the loading bay doors. Someone had set up interior lighting, probably portable floods. The kind that construction crews use. The kind that don't require connection to a building's electrical system. Temporary lighting for a temporary arrangement. I straightened my coat. I walked to the door. I want to tell you that I hesitated here, that there was a moment of doubt, a physical response, quickened pulse, a hesitation in the step. I want to tell you that because it would make me more human, more relatable, and the story better. But I didn't hesitate. I put my hand on the door and I opened it and I walked inside. The warehouse was large, industrial storage, the kind used for shipping containers and heavy equipment. High ceilings, concrete floors with old oil stains that the portable floodlights turned amber. It smelled of rust and salt water and something chemical, cleaning solvent, maybe, or lubricant. There were 8 men that I could see immediately. More, I was certain, in positions I couldn't see, upper levels, behind stacked equipment, in the shadows beyond the range of the lights. Anthony Caruso was standing in the center of the cleared floor space, maybe 40 feet from the door. He was wearing a gray overcoat. He looked, as always, composed and well-assembled, the kind of composure that comes not from genuine calm but from enormous practice at projecting it. Beside him were 2 men I recognized. His head of security, a former military man named Drago, and his consigliere, an older man named Ferrante who had been in the Caruso organization for 30 years, and who was, in my assessment, considerably more intelligent than Anthony. I walked to approximately 20 feet from Anthony and stopped. The door closed behind me. No one spoke for a moment. Then Anthony said, "You came alone." I did. No security. No. He studied me for a moment. I could see him recalibrating. This was not how he had expected this to begin, and the deviation was creating a small but visible uncertainty. Men who plan ambushes have a specific picture in their minds of how it goes. When the target doesn't behave as scripted, the picture blurs. The mechanisms of the plan, which depend on predictable reactions, begin to lag. "That's either very brave or very stupid," Anthony said. Or I said, "It's neither." Another silence. Ferrante, the consigliere, was watching me with an attention that I recognized and respected. He was the most dangerous mind in that room, and he knew something was wrong with this picture. I could see it in the quality of his focus. "You got the offer," Anthony said. "Territorial adjustments, transition of certain operations. I think it's a fair arrangement given." "Anthony," I said. He stopped. "We're not going to talk about territorial adjustments." His jaw tightened fractionally. "Then what are we going to talk about?" "We're going to talk about what you actually came here for," I said. "And then I'm going to tell you something that will change how you understand the last 6 months of your life." In the silence that followed, I became aware of sounds from the upper level. Movement, subtle but there. Drago shifted slightly. Ferrante became very still. I kept my eyes on Anthony. "I'm listening," Anthony said. And there was something in his voice, a tightness, a quality of control being applied that told me he was doing what I wanted him to do. He was managing uncertainty. He was recalibrating while trying not to show it. Good. I know about the ledgers, he said after a pause. I know what's in them. I know where they've been kept. And I know that the right set of eyes on that material would. Would what, I said, would dismantle me. He held my gaze. They're gone, I said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones before it. Excuse me. I burned them, I said, last night. At 2:47 a.m. I watched every page go. I can describe the color of the flame if you'd like. It was orange at the outer edges and blue at the core. It took 11 minutes. Anthony stared at me. Ferrante, to Anthony's left, made a very small sound, not quite a word, something below language, the involuntary vocal response of a man who has just understood something terrible. You burned them, Anthony repeated. Every page. Why? And here is the moment I had been building toward. The moment that the entire preceding week, the paranoia, the investigation, the decision, the walk into the warehouse, had been aimed at. I looked at Anthony Caruso, standing in the center of his own ambush, surrounded by his own men, holding all the cards he thought he held. And I said, because the person who told you about them is standing in this room with you right now. The twist. Watch a man's face when the ground shifts beneath him. It is one of the most instructive things you will ever see. The control, all that careful practice control, it cracks, just for a moment, just long enough for what's underneath to show through. Anthony's face cracked. Not into fear, not immediately. Into confusion first, the specific confusion of a man who has planned meticulously for a specific outcome and is now confronted with a version of events that his planning did not accommodate. Then his eyes moved, involuntarily, a reflex, not a choice. He looked to his right, at Ferrante, and in that single involuntary look, the old consigliere who had been in the Caruso organization for 30 years, who had structured this meeting, this arrangement, this careful campaign to acquire my ledgers and use them to absorb my organization, understood that his position had just changed. Fundamentally and irreversibly. Ferrante was not the betrayer inside my organization. I want to be clear about that. Ferrante was the strategist on Anthony's side, the architect of the approach, the one who had identified the value of the ledgers, who had designed the coalition, who had reached inside my organization and found the weakness. But the look Anthony gave him was not calculating. It was desperate. It was a man looking to his most trusted advisor in the moment when the floor disappears. And that look, that involuntary collapse toward the nearest source of stability, told me everything I needed to know about the actual power dynamic in the Caruso organization. Anthony was not the chess master in that family. Ferrante was. And Ferrante, I had learned through Marcus's investigation, had a problem. Ferrante had a daughter. Her name was Sofia. She was 29 years old and she lived in Milan. She was also, and Ferrante did not know that I knew this, in a relationship with a man who worked for a federal organized crime task force, not as a target, as an asset. An asset whose handler was a federal agent who had, for the past 14 months, been building a case. Not against my organization. Against the Carusos. I had found this through Raymond, through the kind of financial forensics that Raymond could perform that left no fingerprints, that moved through layers of information like water through stone, slow and invisible, and eventually reaching everything. The federal case was not complete. It was not ready to be used, but it existed and it was building. And Ferrante did not know that I knew. And this is the thing about leverage, real leverage, not the crude version, I have information about you, give me what I want or I'll use it, The crude version is just extortion, and it is fragile because it turns into a standoff. Real leverage is structural. It's when you position yourself so that your opponent's every move, including their move against you, plays into your hands. I had not come to this warehouse to survive a confrontation. I had come to end one. "There is no ledger," I said, addressing the room. "Not just Anthony now, all of them. The men I could see and the men I couldn't, in the shadows and the upper levels and the unlit corners. Whatever you were told about its contents, whatever specific information was shared with you to make the approach seem viable, that information was provided to you strategically. It was provided so that I could watch where it went, how it traveled, who received it, and what they planned to do with it." In the silence that followed, I heard someone shift in the upper level, a boot on metal grating. "The person who brought you that information," I continued, "was not working against me. They were working for me. They have been working for me throughout this process. Everything you know about my operation, everything you think you know, was curated. It was a picture I wanted you to see." This was partially true. Let me be honest about that. The investigation that Marcus had conducted had identified the betrayer inside my organization. But the betrayer was not, in fact, a plant. The betrayer was real. The betrayal was real, and it had cut me in the way that real betrayal cuts, deeply, and in a place that doesn't show from the outside. But what I had done, in the 48 hours after Marcus brought me his findings, was reconstruct. I had used the knowledge of the betrayal to feed specific, calibrated information back through the compromised channel. Not everything the mole had provided to Caruso was fabricated, but the most critical piece, the piece that was most actionable, the piece that had made the ledgers seem like a realistically acquirable asset, was fed by me. I had made myself the appetizing target. I had written the script of the ambush, and now I was inside it. "I want to tell you something, Anthony," I said. I stepped forward, closing the distance by 5 feet. He didn't step back. To his credit, he held his ground. "You are a smart man, smarter than your father, honestly. I respected Vincent, but he was a creature of habit. You adapted, you modernized, you built something that could last." I paused. "But you made one mistake. You listened to the wrong man, and that mistake is going to cost you something that you cannot afford to lose." Ferrante spoke for the first time. His voice was steady, remarkably steady, for a man whose position had just imploded. "And what is that?" he said. I looked at him. "The next 6 months," I said, "give or take." He held my gaze. "There's a federal case," I said quietly. "It's not mine. It's not connected to my operation. It's been building for 14 months, and it was triggered by a piece of information that came from inside your organization, not mine. And it is not about organized crime in the traditional sense. It's about financial instruments, securities, the clean side, the legitimate businesses." The color changed in Ferrante's face. Not dramatically, the man was too experienced for drama, but a shade, something left his eyes. "You didn't know," I said. "It wasn't a question." He didn't answer. "The person who triggered it," I continued, "is someone you trusted, someone inside your inner circle, and they've been cooperating for 14 months. I let that sit. In the particular silence that descended, I could feel the reconfiguration happening in real time. The 8 visible men, the others in the shadows, all of them processing, Anthony processing, Ferrante processing, Drago with his hand near his jacket processing, all of them running the same calculation and arriving at the same destination. This is not the ambush we planned. We are inside something else, and we do not know its shape. I came here tonight without a weapon," I said. "I came here alone. I burned the ledgers. I gave up every material advantage I held. I want you to understand why." I looked at Anthony directly. "Because I don't need any of them. I never needed them to manage you. I needed them to manage the world around you, the political infrastructure, the legal architecture, the financial arrangements. Those tools are gone. and I'm still standing here. I let him hear that. That should tell you something about which one of us actually controls this room. The next 4 minutes were the most dangerous of my life. I am not going to pretend otherwise. A man with my information, with my knowledge of their vulnerabilities, in a room full of their armed personnel, the logical response, the simplest response, the response that removed the problem most efficiently, was to kill me right then. I knew this. I had accounted for this. And this is why, in the 48 hours before the meeting, I had done something I had never done in 30 years of operation. I had made a call to a federal contact. Not to cooperate. I want to be precise about this. Not to provide information, not to make any arrangement, not to cross a line that I had never crossed and was not prepared to cross. I had made a call that communicated, through layers of removal, a single piece of information. A specific location, a specific time, a specific gathering of specific individuals. I gave them nothing actionable. I gave them no names. I gave them nothing that could be used in any way that I had not specifically intended. What I gave them was a presence. 3 vehicles, unmarked, parked in locations that I had described precisely. Locations that could be seen from the interior of the warehouse if you knew where to look. I had told Marcus their positions before I walked in. I had told Marcus to make sure that Anthony Caruso's security detail, the men stationed outside the warehouse, saw those vehicles. Not obviously, not theatrically, just enough. Because the knowledge that federal vehicles are parked within visual range of your meeting location creates a specific kind of paralysis. The paralysis of a man who is holding a weapon and is no longer certain he can use it. Who is calculating new consequences. Who is, in the most crucial moment, slowed by uncertainty. And in this life, a man slowed by uncertainty is a man you can negotiate with. The pause stretched. Drago looked at Anthony. Anthony looked at Ferrante. Ferrante looked at me. And I waited. This is the last principle of the chess master. Not aggression, not force, not the dramatic gesture. Patience. The willingness to let the moment mature. To let the opponent see the board, really see it, and reach their own conclusion. Anthony said very quietly, "What do you want?" I said, "I want a conversation, tomorrow, just the 2 of us, no Ferrante." Ferrante's jaw tightened. "And after that," I said, "I want a year of quiet. 1 year during which nothing moves, nothing changes, nothing escalates. 1 year to let a federal investigation that neither of us want proceed in a direction that doesn't touch either of us." I held Anthony's gaze. "And in exchange, I give you nothing except the following. I walk out of this room and this never happened. The conversation you and Ferrante had in the last 6 months about me, about my organization, about strategic acquisition, that conversation evaporates. Professionally. Completely." Anthony was silent for a long moment. "And the man inside your crew," he said, "the one who—" "I'll handle that," I said. "That's not your concern." The ending. Let me tell you about what happened after I walked out of that warehouse. Let me tell you about the things that look like victory and the things that feel like it, and the distance between them. I walked back to my car. It was colder than when I'd arrived. The temperature drops fast on the waterfront in October. The water amplifies it, pulls it down. My breath was visible. My hands were steady. I sat in the car for a moment. I did not feel relief. I want to tell you that and have it be understood clearly, not as false modesty, not as the performance of coolness. I did not feel relief because relief requires the completion of danger, and the danger was not complete. The danger was never complete. In 30 years, the danger had not once been complete. What I felt was, the closest word I can find is resolution. The specific feeling of a decision made and executed, of a complex sequence played through to a specific junction, of a board position achieved. I drove home. Marcus was waiting outside my house. He'd been there since I left. I knew this without him telling me. He was standing in the cold, his hands in his jacket pockets, his face doing what his face did, which was nothing, because Marcus Webb's face was not a mechanism for communication. I got out of the car. He looked at me. A specific quality of looking, assessment, rapid and complete, head to toe, the way soldiers look at returning soldiers. "Hold," I said, meaning unhurt. He exhaled, one breath, the most visible emotion I had seen from him in years. We went inside. I made coffee. This is a detail I include not because it's dramatic, but because it was real, the very ordinary act of making coffee in my kitchen at 1:30 in the morning after what had just happened. The specific smell of ground coffee and hot water, the sound of the machine, the way the light in my kitchen is warm and yellow in a way that is completely inconsistent with the world that existed on the other side of the walls. Marcus sat at the table with his coffee and said nothing. I sat across from him. I put the folded paper from my jacket pocket on the table between us. The paper Raymond had given me. The paper with the 3 anomalies. The paper that pointed in a single direction. Marcus looked at it, then up at me. "I know," he said. "I know you know," I said. A long silence. "When did you figure it out?" I asked. 2 weeks before Victor's call," Marcus said. "I wasn't sure enough to bring it to you. I needed more." "And when you had more?" He looked at me steadily. "I brought it to you, in the envelope." "You did?" I said. "Yes." Marcus picked up his coffee cup. He didn't drink from it. He held it, the way people hold warm things when they need something to hold. "Now I need to tell you who the betrayer was. I have delayed this because it is the part of this story that I find hardest to hold. Not because it destroyed me, it didn't, in the ways that matter operationally, but because it revealed something I had been wrong about. The betrayer was not Marcus. The betrayer was Raymond Cho. Raymond, 63 years old, green tea, 2 cats, PhD in financial mathematics. The man who had restructured my operation and reduced our federal exposure and kept the ledgers, and who had sat across from my desk and given me the 3 anomalies that pointed at himself, had given them to me and framed them as pointing at someone else, confident that I would follow the trail he had laid rather than reverse engineer the layer beneath it. He had been, for approximately 9 months, providing information to Anthony Caruso's organization, not through Ferrante, through a separate channel entirely, one that Ferrante didn't even know about, which was, I had come to understand, precisely the point. Raymond had not simply become a source for the Carusos. He had positioned himself as a potential advisor to the post-Dominic arrangement. He had been, in effect, auditing 2 organizations simultaneously and preparing to shift his expertise to the surviving one. Raymond was not a man driven by grudge or grievance. He was a man driven by optimization. He had made a cold calculation that the Caruso proposition was viable, that my organization's position was weaker than I had acknowledged, and that the intelligent move was to realign his professional interest accordingly. He had, in 30 seconds of financial analysis, decided to burn 20 years of loyalty. And he had been wrong, because he had made one error that a man of his intelligence should not have made. He had underestimated how much I trusted him. Not in the naive sense, not in the sense that made me vulnerable. He had underestimated how deeply I had factored his expertise into my contingency planning. He had underestimated the degree to which his analytical patterns, his specific fingerprints, the way he organized and framed information, were legible to me after 20 years of working together. He had given me the 3 anomalies to mislead me, but the way he had selected and framed them, the specific combination of data points, the particular calibration of how much to reveal, it was the same brain that had organized my ledgers for 2 decades. I had recognized him in the framing before I'd fully consciously identified the content. And then, once I'd looked at it that way, everything else fell into alignment. The question was what to do with it. Here is what I decided. I did not move against Raymond before the meeting. I gave him no indication that I knew. I allowed him to continue operating with full access for 5 days after Marcus confirmed the identification, because those 5 days were when I needed the compromised channel to be functional, to feed the specific, calibrated information that drew the Carusos into the arrangement I needed them in. Raymond, unwittingly, had become the instrument of his own undoing. He had thought he was feeding intelligence to the Carusos. He had been feeding them the intelligence I wanted them to have. And after the meeting, after I walked out of the warehouse and drove home and made coffee in my kitchen at 1:30 a.m., I made one more call. Not to the Carusos, not to anyone in my organization. To a federal contact. This time the communication was more specific. This time it provided, through the appropriate channels and with the appropriate distance, certain financial information, specific transactions, specific accounts, specific patterns that related not to my organization, but to an individual acting in a private capacity. An individual engaged in certain activities that were substantially unrelated to organized crime and substantially related to securities fraud. The second act of Raymond's career, the one he thought nobody knew about. The optimization that Raymond had been running on the side of his optimization of my operation. A separate financial scheme, modest by the standards of what he managed for me, but real and documented and traceable in ways that he had perhaps assumed I would never look for. I had looked for them in the 48 hours after Marcus's confirmation. Raymond had underestimated how much I'd learned from 20 years of watching him work. I provided that information, precisely targeted, surgically delivered. Raymond was arrested 14 days later, not for anything connected to me, not for anything connected to my organization, for securities fraud, which carried a different set of consequences and a different set of questions, and led, in the investigation that followed, nowhere near the territories that I needed protected. He is currently serving 9 years. He never named me. I don't fully know why. Perhaps because naming me would have required explaining the full context, which would have complicated his own position. Perhaps because, at 63 years old, a man draws certain lines about who he will become in the final chapters of his life. Perhaps because, in some residual way that I cannot fully understand and will not pretend to, something of what we had built together over 20 years was not entirely erased by what he had done. I do not forgive him. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness requires something that I do not have in adequate supply, and it would be dishonest to perform it. What I have is understanding, which is different. Understanding of the calculation he made and where it went wrong and what it cost him and what it cost me. Understanding is colder than forgiveness. It is also more durable. Anthony Caruso and I met the following afternoon. Alone, as I had requested, in a restaurant in the kind of neighborhood that neither of us would typically frequent, the kind of neighborhood where two men in good coats attract no particular attention because everyone in the room has their own private version of discretion. We sat across from each other with espresso. Anthony Caruso, without Ferrante, was a different man, younger seeming, more uncertain in the way that intelligent people become uncertain when the frameworks they've been operating within are suddenly revealed to be someone else's construction. He said after we'd established that we were alone and not recording, Ferrante. I waited. He built this whole thing without, he stopped, reconsidered, started again. I knew the broad strokes, the approach, the general strategy. I didn't know all of it. I didn't know the federal situation. I know, I said. He looked at me. How much of what you said last night was true? Enough, I said. He absorbed this. He was smart enough not to press for specifics. The year of quiet, he said. You want a full year. I want a full year. And Ferrante. Ferrante is your problem, I said. I have no opinion about how you handle him. That is internal to your organization and it is none of my business. He nodded slowly. What guarantees do I have? He said. I looked at him for a moment. The same guarantee you've always had, I said. The guarantee that I am better at this than you and that working with me, even at this distance, even in this arrangement, is materially better for you than working against me. That's not a threat. That's an assessment of our respective positions. He was quiet. I will add this, I said. I don't want your operation. I have never wanted your operation. I have no interest in the Eastern Territories. I have no interest in your political arrangements. I have no interest in anything that belongs to your family. What I want is to operate in peace within my own domain. That's what I've always wanted. Anthony, that's all I've ever wanted. Something shifted in his face, something subtle and complicated. The expression of a man encountering, for the first time, the possibility that the war he'd been preparing for might be unnecessary. The particular disorientation that comes with that realization, not relief exactly, but the recalibration of months of carefully maintained hostility encountering an absence of hostile terrain. Then why did my father, he started. Your father and I had an arrangement, I said. It was imperfect. There were tensions, but it held for 11 years. The tensions in the last 3 were not about territory. They were about Ferrante's ambitions, which are not the same as your family's interests. He sat with that for a long time. I finished my espresso. The year of quiet, I said again. He looked at me, and then Anthony Caruso did something I had not expected. He extended his hand across the table. I looked at it for a moment. Then I shook it. Not because it meant anything binding. Handshakes between men in our position are theater. Everyone on both sides knows this. But theater serves a function. Theater marks a transition, names a moment, makes real something that would otherwise remain provisional. The handshake was the beginning of the end of a war that could have cost both of us everything. We paid our respective checks and walked out in different directions. Ferrante was retired from the Caruso organization within 3 weeks. The manner of that retirement was, as I had told Anthony, none of my business, and I made no inquiries into it. He is alive, as far as I know, living somewhere considerably less comfortable than his previous circumstances. Victor, the man from Pittsburgh who had called me with the warning, I sent him a specific kind of acknowledgement that is understood in our world as meaningful appreciation without creating a formal debt or obligation. He understood what it meant. He was pleased. We have had no further direct contact, which is precisely the appropriate outcome. The federal vehicles on the waterfront that night, they were not a deception, but they were also not as significant as I had implied. 2 vehicles, not 3. Their presence was not coordinated with any active operation. They were simply present by fortunate coincidence, positioned for an entirely unrelated surveillance. I had spotted them 2 days earlier during a walkthrough of the area. I had built them into my arrangement without knowing specifically what they meant. The uncertainty they created in Anthony's people was the product of their imagination, not mine. Sometimes the board position you need is created by luck. The chess master's job is to recognize it and use it. Marcus is still with me. We have not spoken extensively about Raymond. There was one conversation, brief, a week after the arrest. Marcus said, "I should have brought it to you sooner." I said, "You brought it when you were sure." He nodded. We have not discussed it since. Some things between people who have operated together for a long time do not require continued examination. They become part of the shared history that exists in the space between conversations. Marcus's daughter Claire is in her final year at Penn State. She is, by all accounts, exceptional. Marcus still carries her photograph in his jacket pocket. He still never mentions her. I still know she's there. The ledgers are gone. I have not started new ones. This surprises me still. I am aware of the absence every day. The way you are aware of a piece of furniture that's been removed from a room you've lived in for decades. The space where it was is not empty. It's occupied by the memory of the thing, by the shape it left. I run my operation differently now. The information I kept in those books lives in other forms, distributed, decentralized, held across multiple people and systems in ways that require collaboration to access, that cannot be seized by any single actor. Raymond's insight was correct, as it happens. The ledgers were a concentration of power that created a concentration of risk. His error was in thinking that the solution was to acquire that concentration for a different owner. The actual solution was to dismantle the concentration itself. I needed the threat of losing the ledgers to see that clearly. Sometimes the most valuable thing an enemy does for you is show you your own vulnerability. There is one more thing, one more quiet moment that I want to give you, because this story is not only about tactics and leverage and the geometry of power. 3 days after the warehouse, late afternoon, I went to the waterfront alone. Not the warehouse location, a different stretch further north, where it's open and the water is visible and there are no buildings blocking the sky. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes in the cold, looking at the water. I was thinking about the ledgers, about what it meant to have written them, to have spent 22 years carefully documenting everything, as though documentation were permanence, as though recording something could prevent it from changing or ending. I was thinking about Gerald Fitch, who had done the same thing and died of natural causes at 67, leaving his ledger to a 19-year-old who read it once and understood everything, and then spent 2 decades learning that understanding everything and controlling everything are not the same thing. I was thinking about the fire, the orange and blue, the 11 minutes. There's something that happens when you destroy something you've built over decades. Something that isn't grief. Grief implies that the destruction is unintended, unwanted. What I felt was different. It was something like perspective, like the specific clarity that only comes from loss. You can hold something so tightly for so long that you forget you're holding it. You forget the weight. You forget what your hands feel like when they're open. Standing at the waterfront in the cold, 3 days after the warehouse, I was aware for the first time in years of what my hands felt like open. Not empty, open. There's a difference. I don't know if I'll ever be fully able to articulate what this life has cost. The ledgers were partly an attempt to articulate it, to get it all outside of my own head, to make it concrete, to give it a form that could be organized and referenced, and, in some obscure way, understood. Burning them was an admission that some things cannot be organized, that some costs do not balance, that you live in the life you have chosen, and you carry what you carry, and the best you can do is know exactly what you're doing and why. I stood at the waterfront for 20 minutes. Then I went home. Anthony Caruso is still operating. We have maintained our distance. In 3 years, there has been no significant friction. Ferrante's absence from the Caruso operation has had the predictable effect of reducing their strategic ambition, which has been, for everyone involved, a form of stability. My organization is smaller than it was 5 years ago, deliberately. Raymond's departure created a restructuring that I used as an opportunity to reduce the scope of operations in ways that reduce exposure. Less is not always less. Sometimes less is the most sophisticated play. I am 61 years old. I do not know how this ends. No one does. That is not unique to this life. That is simply life, the particular uncertainty of being a conscious being in an unpredictable world, with no ledger comprehensive enough to document it all and no fire hot enough to release you from it. What I know is this. I sat in a basement at 2:47 in the morning with 4 books that contained the architecture of everything I had built, and I burned them. I walked unarmed into a room full of people who intended to kill me. I played the board the only way I knew how, completely, patiently, and without flinching. And I'm still here. Not triumphant, not clean, not in any conventional sense at peace. But here, still, and in this life, in any life honestly, that is not a small thing. The night before the warehouse, when I was standing over the ash in my basement, watching the last of it cool into gray and white, I made myself one promise. I promised myself that I would not replace what I had burned with something equal in size and weight, something that would again become the thing I couldn't let go of, the thing that my enemies could use to own me. I kept that promise, not because it was easy, because the alternative, rebuilding the same cage with different materials and calling it an empire, is the thing that destroys men who should have known better. Power isn't about what you own. It isn't about what you know. It isn't even about who fears you. Power at its core, real power, the kind that outlasts the ledgers and the lieutenants and the leverage, is about what you're willing to erase, including yourself, including the version of yourself that believed he needed all of it. I burned 4 books. I walked into a room full of men who wanted me dead. I walked out, not because of what I had, because of what I was willing to lose. The most dangerous man in any room isn't the one holding the most. It's the one who has already decided what he can live without. Dominic Cross.